Cuckoo's call marks more than the hour. It marks a crime. Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Drop a comment with your location. I love hearing from you all. Now, into the case. The cuckoo clock had chimed 7 times in the quiet parlor of Hollyhock House when Mrs. Penrose first noticed something was amiss. It was not the cuckoo itself, though its wooden beak seemed oddly askew, but the absence of her dear friend Mr. Randall, who had been expected for tea. She fussed with the silver sugar tongs, casting glances at the door, and remarking with increasing sharpness to her maid that punctuality was the very backbone of civilization. Yet no amount of brisk talk could disguise the thin thread of worry that began to wind itself about her thoughts. In St. Mary Mead, lateness was not taken lightly, and gossip traveled faster than the mail coach. By the time Mrs. Penrose's maid, Alice, had stepped out to fetch a jug of cream, word was already fluttering its way down the high street that Mr. Randall had been seen neither at the greengrocer's nor on the path from the railway station. Mrs. Grover, peering over her gate, remarked to anyone within earshot that she had spotted his hat through the window of Hollyhock House that very morning. Though she could not say whether it was still there now, Miss Marple, seated by her cottage window with her knitting needles flashing softly in the waning light, listened without seeming to. Young Tommy Briggs had breathlessly brought the news, more interested in the thrill of a possible disappearance than in any real concern for Mr. Randall. She merely asked him if he thought the rooks had nested early this year and returned to her knitting. Those who knew her well might have caught the faint narrowing of her eyes, the sort of delicate change that meant a new puzzle had been added to her quiet collection. The first hint of real trouble came when Sergeant Willis arrived, his boots crunching the gravel with an urgency that did not suit the mild spring afternoon. He entered Hollyhock House and emerged some minutes later with a face considerably more grim than when he had gone in. A pair of constables followed, one of them carrying a folded blanket in the careful, deliberate manner of someone handling something fragile and final. By the time the evening lamps were lit, the cuckoo clock had struck 8, its little bird jerking forward in its wooden cage. In the village, whispers grew darker. Mr. Randall had been found in the parlor of Hollyhock House, slumped beside the low table where tea for 2 had been laid out, stone cold and untouched. The cause was not immediately clear, but the expression on the man's face suggested he had seen something, or someone, he had not expected. Something that had stopped the heart as surely as any blade or bullet. Miss Marple, as ever, remained unobtrusive, listening to the fragments of conversation passing through the evening air. One remark, tossed off without thought by Mrs. Grover as she shuffled home, caught her ear: that the cuckoo clock had been chiming the wrong hour all week. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a curious thing for a clock to lie. Curious indeed. Miss Marple rose early the next morning, as she always did, when the dew still clung like pearl dust to the hedgerows, and the rooks argued amongst themselves on the churchyard yews. She moved about her cottage with efficient softness, laying aside the finished length of a pale blue scarf, and allowed herself the small luxury of watching the village assemble its public face for the day. Windows were opened, mats shaken, and the baker's cart rattled down the lane at precisely the moment it always had. Save that today, people looked up from their doormats and watched it pass as if it carried not loaves but tidings. The news of Mr. Randall had thickened in the air like an unexpected fog. Even the morning seemed mindful of it. Hollyhock House lay at the top of a slight rise, a gracious edifice with ivy that had made itself too much at home. Mrs. Penrose, whose talent for genteel order had long been the envy of the Women's Institute, stood at her gate with a handkerchief she did not use and a smile that failed to reach her eyes. She greeted Miss Marple with the kind of warmth one extends to an aunt who has never yet given bad advice. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, and her voice trembled on the edges. "Such a terrible business. Sergeant Willis says I am not to upset myself, which is a thing that cannot be commanded. Do come in for a few minutes. If one sits alone with one's thoughts, they grow unmanageable." "Quite often," Miss Marple agreed, with the politest commiseration. "A little company is like a light in a passage one has to cross." Inside, the parlor had been put to rights as far as the police would allow. The tea things had been removed, but the imprint of a cup remained faintly upon the cloth, a pale ring like a ghost of sociability. The Cuckoo clock, fat wooden, Swiss, with a chalet roof and a tree with a carved fawn, sat high on the wall, its pendulum making a sound too sprightly by half. It was a clock that had opinions about punctuality, and expressed them noisily. Miss Marple looked at it as one might look at a child who had told a lie and not done it well. "It struck 7 quite loudly last evening," Mrs. Penrose said, following her glance. "Just as I found, well, as Alice found." Her hand shook, and the handkerchief at last had something to do. "Alice is your maid?" Miss Marple asked, as though she were asking if the azaleas had done well that year. "Yes. Poor girl. She was the one who brought the police from the corner. I had expected Mr. Randall at 4:30. You know how he is about time, or was. Punctuality, always punctuality. He would say that if trains can keep schedules, so can men. I had the tea laid. At 5, I sent Tommy Briggs along to the station path. Boys, do enjoy an errand. At 6, I began to worry. Sergeant Willis says the time may be important, though what difference an hour or two makes to a tragedy I cannot see. Often, my dear, it makes all the difference," Miss Marple said mildly. Mrs. Penrose dabbed at her eyes. "He was a dear friend. People will talk, I suppose. They always do. Some will say he paid me undue attention. Others will say he did not pay me enough. People," Miss Marple murmured, "are rarely content with the exact measure of another's affection." A footfall in the hall announced Sergeant Willis, solid and decent, with a careful tread that suggested he believed any misstep might disturb a sacred boundary. He greeted Miss Marple respectfully. He had once declined to take her advice and had suffered the small humiliation of a mistake neatly pointed out and never mentioned again. "Mrs. Penrose," he said, "if you feel up to it, there are a few questions I must put to you. Miss Marple, good morning. I won't drive you out, but I shall have to talk in front of you." "The kettles in this village are used to boiling in company," Miss Marple said. "Pray proceed." Willis opened a notebook. "At what time precisely did you last see Mr. Randall alive?" Mrs. Penrose swallowed. "He called in the morning, just after 11, to say he would come for tea at 4:30. He did not say from where he would come. He had been occupied of late. Business matters." "What sort?" "I did not ask," she said quickly. Then, with a flicker of pride, "But I gathered he was advising Mr. Pettigrew about the lease for the old mill. You know how Mr. Pettigrew is with figures. A terror at the church accounts, but utterly at sea with paper that has seals on it. Mr. Randall had the talent for small economies. He liked to save pennies so the pounds might notice and be ashamed." "And did anyone else know Mr. Randall would be here at 4:30? Willis asked. Mrs. Penrose hesitated. "I told Mrs. Grover when I passed her gate. She asked me if she should expect a third for whist in the evening. I said no, that I had company already. She saw Mr. Randall's hat on my hall table this morning, so she says. I don't know how. The door was not open, and I keep the hall curtains drawn on account of the afternoon sun." Willis scratched behind his ear with his pencil. You didn't notice anything out of place when you came into the parlor? Only that the clock was striking the hour again, just as Alice called from the hall. It chimed 7 while the tea was still laid for 2, and then I saw him. He was in the low chair by the fire. I thought at first he had fainted. I thought. Her composure, so carefully arrayed, wobbled. It was the look, Sergeant. A look of having remembered something too late. Willis shut the notebook and gave a small, practical sigh. Dr. Bellamy puts the time of death somewhere between 5 and 6, very broad that. No marks, nothing obvious. We've taken away the cups, though Mrs. Penrose says they were untouched. We'll know more when the doctor has done his part. Untouched in the usual sense, Miss Marple said, with a considering kindness that made both of them look at her. But sometimes people touch things and put them back to rights, the way an anxious hostess will adjust a place setting twice over without knowing she has done it. Mrs. Penrose stared, then blinked as if a veil had been lifted from a far corner of her mind. I did. No, I don't believe, well, the sugar tongs. I did set them down and then pick them up. Alice had put them out of their proper place, and I cannot bear a symmetry. Oh, what a foolish detail to remember. Foolish details, Miss Marple said gently, are often the only ones that are true. We embroider the important things and leave the small ones plain. Willis, who had learned to treasure such remarks, made a note he would not be able to explain later. There's also the clock, he added. Mrs. Grover says it's been keeping the wrong hour for a week. It told 7 last night, yet by my watch it was 10 past 8. A clock that lies, Miss Marple murmured. Some clocks lie by accident, and some because someone has turned their faces to the wall. Has anyone been in the parlor besides Mrs. Penrose and Alice since Mr. Randall telephoned in the morning? Julian called, Mrs. Penrose said, and the words were given reluctantly, as if they had been waiting in the wings and had missed their cue. My nephew, only for a moment. He wished to borrow the small ladder for his apple trees. He came in at the back and took it from the scullery. I had no conversation with him then. He is young. Young men, Miss Marple offered, often take ladders without announcing it. Julian's a good lad, Willis said too quickly. Works at the garage, knows his hours. He was on duty till 6. So he says, Mrs. Penrose murmured, the faintest stiffness in her voice. He is very clever with carburetors, and not as clever with truth when he is in a temper. Miss Marple smiled into her sleeve. Truth is a difficult machine to tune. It will idle beautifully for the one who knows where the throttle sticks. Besides the nephew, Willis resumed. Anyone else know of the tea plan? Mrs. Alder from the post office, Mrs. Penrose said. She asked if I had received the circular about the fete committee, and I told her I could not serve on Tuesday as I had company. She will have told 3 people by now and 4 by noon. The sergeant closed his book again. I'll want to speak to Alice, and to Julian, and to Mr. Pettigrew, and Mrs. Grover, since she seems to know what everyone's hat is doing at any hour. You'll find Alice in the kitchen, Mrs. Penrose said, looking diminished by fatigue. I cannot help thinking, she added, almost to herself, that if Mr. Randall had never admired my roses, this would not have happened. It is very silly, but one thinks these things when one is tired. Miss Marple reached and, with delicate firmness, adjusted the fringe of the parlor curtain so that it sat square. One thinks all sorts of things when one is tired. Rest is very often the first step toward remembering what one has actually seen. In the kitchen, Alice stood with her hands plunged into a basin that did not require washing. She had a round, freckled face that did not lend itself easily to deception, and she avoided looking at the older woman in a way that suggested she feared to be found out for something trivial rather than monstrous. Miss Marple asked her about the tea with an interest that seemed to have more to do with etiquette than tragedy. "I laid it at 4:15, ma'am," Alice said, voice thin. "2 cups, the good ones, the little silver strainer, the lemon slices. Mrs. likes them thin. She says they should look like the sun seen through a cloud. I kept the kettle ready in case he came to the door, quick-like. Then I went to fetch the cream from Mr. Alder. When I came back," her hands tightened in the dishwater. "When I came back, I heard the clock, and then the missus crying out. I ran in. He looked—" She gulped. "I didn't touch nothing." "No," Miss Marple said absently. "No, I don't expect you did. Did anyone call while you were out?" Alice shook her head. "Only Mrs. Grover at the gate to ask if the roses had blight. I said no and asked her to mind the cream if the boy brought it. She said she would, but I wouldn't trust her to mind a cloud. She asked if the gentleman had come, and I said not yet, and she said he liked to look at the clock. I thought that was a queer thing to say." Miss Marple's brows lifted. Mr. Randall liked to look at the clock? That's what she said. That he'd said to her once it was a fine piece and always knew what time it was, which I could have told him was wrong. It's been silly for days. Miss Marple thanked her and drifted back to the parlor where Sergeant Willis was consulting his watch under the scowl of the Cuckoo. She stood below the clock and gazed at it with the mild, indulgent scrutiny she reserved for lamplighters and vicars' sermons. The beak of the bird was, indeed, a shade askew. The pendulum swing felt eager, like a child kept up past bedtime. On the floor beneath the clock, hardly more than a shaving, lay a sliver of something pale that had pretensions to gold. She did not bend to pick it up. She simply noted that it was there and, after a moment, looked up again. "Sergeant," she said pleasantly, "have you perhaps noticed that the clock's weights are not quite even?" Willis peered. "I don't know that I'd have the eye for it, Miss Marple." "They seldom are perfectly even," she admitted. "But when a clock that is habitually wrong wishes to persuade one that it is right, it may be encouraged to do so. By a person determined, for instance, to be elsewhere at the time the clock says they were not." She smiled as if she had made a remark about the weather. Willis, who had come to translate such sayings with painful slowness, made another mark in his book and looked more carefully at the chains and weights. They left Mrs. Penrose to her rest, with assurances and the sturdy promise of a constable on the lane. Outside, the village showed its true morning. The chink of milk bottles, the conversation of chickens, the small coughs of engines that had learned to start their day without complaint. On the path, they encountered Julian Penrose coming up at a good clip, his hair carefully disordered in a way that suggested practice. He lifted a hand when he saw them and then lowered it, uncertain which version of himself to present. "Aunt said you were looking for me," he told Willis, before the sergeant could speak. "I heard about Mr. Randall. Beastly. We fixed his motorcycle last month. He never overpaid, mind, but he paid." "You were at the garage until 6?" Willis asked. "Until past," Julian said promptly. He saw the look and amended, "Until near 6. We had a rover that wouldn't catch. Mr. Dent can vouch, unless he's in town for spares, in which case he can't." Miss Marple, who could make any question sound like an offering of cake, said, "You borrowed a ladder yesterday?" Julian's surprise seemed real enough. "Yes. For the apples. They said early this year. Aunt said I might." "And did you come through the scullery?" I always do. The front door squeaks like a scold. I don't like to set Aunt off about the hinges. Did you look in the parlor as you went by? He hesitated, then shrugged. Only to see the time. The clock's always wrong, but you look anyhow, don't you? Habit. It said 5 to 4. I laughed at it. That would have been, 20 to 5. I meant to mention it. But Aunt doesn't like to be told her things are silly. Willis made another note. Did you see Mr. Randall? Number if I had. I'd have said hello and made myself scarce. Aunt's teas are not for men with oil under their nails. Miss Marple observed him a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then smiled as if she had decided he might wash his hands properly when he remembered. You are a dutiful nephew to return the ladder promptly. Julian colored. Yes, I'll fetch it back today. They parted there. Willis went toward the high street, Miss Marple toward the churchyard, where people who wished not to be seen could be seen by anyone who knew where to stand. Mrs. Grover, of course, materialized as though summoned by the thought of being asked a question. Dreadful, Miss Marple, she said, half whisper, half relish. Dreadful. I said at the time that man would come to a bad end, always looking at things he had no business to look at. Clocks, for instance, Miss Marple suggested. Mrs. Grover blinked. Why, yes. He admired that Cuckoo to me on Monday. Said it was a faithful creature, faithful, and struck the hours like a verger. I told him it was wrong as wrong could be, but he only laughed. And then there's Mr. Pettigrew, who said in the shop that Mr. Randall was meddling with his lease. Men with leases are always wrought up. I remember when my Henry signed for the allotment, he couldn't sleep a wink for fear the Cabbages were now legal persons entitled to live in the front room. Heaven forbid, Miss Marple murmured. Tell me, Mrs. Grover, since you are so fortunate in opportunity, did you happen to see anyone go into Hollyhock House between 4:30 and 6? Mrs. Grover tilted her head, pleased to be asked what she had already prepared to answer. I saw Mr. Pettigrew pass with his umbrella, a fine one, too. And I saw Alice go out with a jug. And I saw the vicar's wife stop to look at the roses. But the vicar's wife looks at everything as though she meant to improve it, so that's not unusual. Oh, and there was the postmistress's girl bringing a parcel. Thin paper, something light. A parcel, Miss Marple repeated, as if she were testing a stitch. Delivered to whom? To Mrs. Penrose, I suppose. She took it in herself when Alice was out, because I saw the door move and her hand, on the latch. Very white fingers, Mrs. Penrose has. She keeps them out of the sun. Miss Marple thanked her with the air of one who will now go home and make raspberry jam. Instead, she turned back toward Hollyhock House. On the gatepost, a small smear of something pale caught her eye. A trace of talc, perhaps, or dust from paper. She touched it lightly and rubbed her finger against her thumb. Fine, dry, with the faintest suggestion of fragrance, not unlike the sachets they tucked into linen drawers. Inside the parlor, the clock approved the hour again, as if satisfied it had made its case. Miss Marple stood beneath it and looked along the line of the mantel. A minute, white-edged square of trimming thread lay near the candlestick. The kind of thread one snips from new linen. A foolish detail, perhaps, or not. She rang for Alice and asked, as if delighting in household trivia, whether Mrs. Penrose had received any new linens. Alice thought, then brightened. Why, yes, ma'am. Yesterday. Some lace-edged napkins. Mrs. said they were too fine for every day. She was in a taking about it because they came early, and she likes things to arrive on the day she expects. Some people do, Miss Marple said, and her eyes went to the clock with a tenderness that was not all for the object itself. They like hours and days to line up as they are told. It is so restful. When she left, the lane seemed somehow narrower, as though the houses had drawn a little closer to hear better. The story, Miss Marple knew, would not be solved by poisons and powders alone, though both might have their place. It would be solved, as such stories always are, by the way people's habits of mind betray them when they attempt to imitate chance. A lying clock, a host who liked her symmetry, a nephew who laughed at 5 to 4, a parcel of lace that arrived early, a man who admired punctuality because he mistrusted his own impulses. As she came up to her gate, Miss Marple found Dr. Bellamy waiting with his hat in his hand and his mouth set in professional ambiguity. "No obvious cause," he said before she asked. "No bruising, no injury. If he was frightened, it did not leave a mark the body understands. I'll know more later. But I do wonder, have you ever known a strong heart to stop for no reason at tea time?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said, with a small, sorrowful smile. "When the reason is not the kind we list on certificates. When the reason is wrapped in courtesy. When the reason is a shock that has been planned for one in advance." Dr. Bellamy stared at her, as men do when sensible things sound like riddles. Miss Marple opened her gate. "There will be another little shock yet," she added, almost to herself. "That is generally how such people arrange matters. 2 clocks should strike wrong if one is to be believed." She went inside to her knitting, the pale blue scarf lying exactly where she had left it, and let the village run to tell itself what it thought it knew. The next day dawned with a clean, brisk wind that seemed intent on sweeping the cobwebs from the eaves and the talk from people's tongues into every open window in St. Mary Mead. In the high street, shopkeepers found themselves repeating the same phrases to different customers, each time adding or trimming a detail according to the listener's taste. By 9 o'clock, the circumstances of Mr. Randall's death had been recounted in no fewer than 6 versions, none of which, Miss Marple reflected, could be called entirely reliable. She, meanwhile, sat with her morning tea by the parlor window, her knitting in her lap, allowing her mind to wander, apparently. In truth, she was sifting the events of the previous day, through that fine mesh of observation which caught the tiny, telling crumbs others overlooked. The cuckoo clock, the early parcel of lace-edged napkins, Julian's careful laughter at the wrong hour, Mrs. Grover's relish in reporting, Alice's artless mention of Mr. Randall's habit of looking at the clock. Each was a petal from a larger bloom, and she meant to see the whole flower in time. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of the post. The young postmistress's assistant, a sturdy girl named Violet, came briskly up the path, a brown envelope in hand. "For you, Miss Marple." "Registered," she said with the air of someone imparting royal correspondence. "They say there's to be an inquest tomorrow afternoon. You'll be going, I suppose?" "Indeed I shall, Violet," Miss Marple replied. "The workings of the human conscience are as fascinating as the workings of the human stomach, though not, perhaps, as well understood." Violet grinned uncertainly, as though sensing she had been handed a thought that was either very wise or very silly. She left. Miss Marple placed the envelope aside for later. Her interest this morning lay elsewhere, in the matter of Mr. Pettigrew, and what business of his might have brought him past Hollyhock House at the critical hour. By 10:30, she was at the old mill, its weathered timbers leaning as though listening to the water's gossip. Mr. Pettigrew was inside, surrounded by a confusion of papers and a smell of damp wood. He was a lean, brisk man with a mustache that bristled as if ready to defend him from unwelcome truths. "My dear Miss Marple," he said with genuine warmth, "come to see the old place before the council pulls it down." "I hope that won't be necessary," she said. "Such buildings ought to be cherished. I hear Mr. Randall was advising you about your lease." Pettigrew's mustache twitched. "That's correct. It's up for renewal, and the owner, some cousin of the previous landlord, is making noises about doubling the rent. Randall had a way with such matters. He could make you think you were getting the better end when in fact he was. Not a bad fellow, mind you, just shrewd." "And you spoke with him recently?" "Day before yesterday. He promised to have papers ready by Thursday. That's why I was headed to see him yesterday afternoon. I thought he might be able to show me a draft, but I never got the chance. The constable on the lane said no one was to go in. Tragic business." "You passed Mrs. Penrose's house?" "Yes. The curtains were drawn in the parlor, but the front door was ajar. I thought perhaps she'd stepped out to the garden, so I didn't knock. The cuckoo was going off. Wrong hour, of course. I was nearly tempted to go in and fix it myself." Miss Marple's gaze rested on him mildly. "But you did not?" No. I've a horror of intruding. Besides, I had other errands. I walked on to the green, spoke with the vicar about the fete. By then the talk had already started that something was wrong." She thanked him and left him to his papers, noting that his account fitted neatly into the outer edge of events, close enough to touch them, far enough to avoid being caught within. From the mill she walked to the garage, where Julian was bent under the bonnet of a Morris. His face, when he saw her, was less easy than the day before. Perhaps Sergeant Willis had been to see him again. "Your ladder was much in use, I hear," she said cheerfully. Julian straightened, wiping his hands. "Yes. Apples again this morning. Aunt doesn't like them falling on the lawn. Says it spoils the look. And yesterday, after you took the ladder, I went straight back to work, only stopped to glance in at the parlor. I told you that." "Yes," she said softly. "It's a funny thing about glancing in rooms. One often sees more than one expects. Did you happen to notice if the tea was late?" Julian frowned. Yes. 2 cups, saucers, silver tongs. All neat as a pin. Aunt's fussy about that. Randall hadn't arrived then. If he had, I'd have heard his voice." She smiled. "Voices carry oddly in that house. One hears them clearly in the scullery, but not in the parlor if the door is shut. You would have had to open it to be sure." "I didn't open it," he said quickly. Then, with a half-smile that was not entirely friendly, "You've a knack for making it sound as if everyone's lying to you, Miss Marple." "My dear boy, I never assume such a thing," she said. "It would be exhausting to suspect everyone. I merely note when the truth limps a little." By midday, she had taken a light lunch at the Blue Boar, where Mrs. Grover, purely by accident of course, was seated within conversational distance. Miss Marple allowed herself to be drawn into talk of the inquest. "They'll ask about the clock," Mrs. Grover said with satisfaction. "I told the constable it's been wrong for days, and I told him about the parcel, white paper tied with blue string. I could see it plain when Mrs. Penrose took it in. She looked about too, like she thought no one would notice. That's telling, isn't it?" "It is often telling when someone notices they are being noticed," Miss Marple agreed. "Do you happen to know where the parcel came from?" "From Hillman's in Much Benham. They sell linens and such. My cousin works there. She said they'd had an order for lace napkins, extra fine, sent to Mrs. Penrose on the Tuesday, only they weren't to be delivered till Friday. Funny to send them early. Perhaps the post was faster than expected. Mrs. Grover sniffed. Or perhaps someone wanted them there in time for tea. Miss Marple let the remark drift between them like thistledown, unpinned but noticeable. That afternoon, Sergeant Willis called at her cottage. He looked weary. Doctor's reports in. Cause of death, digitalis poisoning. Traces in his stomach mixed with tea. But there's no sign he took any before he came to Hollyhock House. Digitalis, Miss Marple repeated, setting down her knitting. That can be taken as a tonic, in proper doses. And in improper ones, it stops the heart without much fuss. Willis nodded grimly. That's the picture. Tea was laid for 2, but both cups were untouched when we found them. Which means either he drank before they were poured, or someone poured and washed the cup before we arrived. Or, Miss Marple said, someone arranged matters so that it would appear he had not drunk at all, while, in fact, he had. A neat hostess might remove a cup if she thought it spotted or cracked, replacing it with another before the guest arrived. Willis frowned. You think Mrs. Penrose? I think Mrs. Penrose likes things in their proper place. If she saw something amiss with the tea setting, she would correct it instantly, without thinking. And in doing so, she might conceal a detail she never intended to hide. The cuckoo clock struck 3. Wrongly, for it was not yet 2:30. Miss Marple glanced at it, her eyes resting on the uneven weights. Sergeant, when you have a moment, you might ask yourself who benefits from a clock that does not match the hour. It can be a very useful alibi if one's presence or absence is measured by it. Willis made a non-committal sound, but his pencil moved. When he had gone, Miss Marple sat back and let her mind trace the pattern forming. The lace napkins, arriving early, were more than a quirk of delivery. They had brought something into the house, perhaps not lace alone. A powder could be folded neatly within, unnoticed until needed. And the clock, its hands kept deliberately wrong, could make a meeting seem earlier or later than it was. She thought of Julian's laughter at its error, of Mr. Pettigrew's temptation to set it right, of Mrs. Penrose's insistence on symmetry, of Alice's simple honesty. By evening, the talk in the village had turned to the inquest, and who would be called. Miss Marple knew she would attend, and she suspected that the inquest would yield not only facts, but the small, human betrayals that always interested her most. She had seen it before. The moment when someone hears a detail they thought safely buried and reacts too quickly, too sharply. It was, in its own way, like the cuckoo's call. Sudden, mechanical, and revealing more about the hour than the clock itself. As she drew the curtains against the night, she glanced once more at her own small mantel clock, which kept time faithfully. In her experience, a truthful clock was no less dangerous than a lying one. It all depended on whose story it was telling. And tomorrow, she thought, there would be more stories told than the inquest was prepared to hear. The day of the inquest arrived with a dampness that seemed to flatten the air. The sort of mild, gray oppression that made the village green appear almost sullen. A few pale blossoms clung stubbornly to the borders along the lane to the parish hall, their heads bowed as though in expectation of some unwelcome announcement. The villagers, by contrast, were alert and restless. For all the solemn purpose of the proceeding, an inquest in St. Mary, Mead, was as much a social occasion as a legal one, and the hard benches in the hall would be filled well before the coroner arrived. Miss Marple took her seat in the second row, neither too close to be conspicuous nor too far to miss any useful detail. She settled her handbag in her lap and appeared entirely at ease. her mild gaze passing over the gathering with the unfocused attentiveness of someone watching pigeons on a lawn. She noted, however, who avoided whose eyes, who greeted whom with forced civility, and who seemed altogether too interested in the coroner's table at the front. Mrs. Penrose entered on Sergeant Willis's arm, her face pale but composed, the black of her hat's net veil setting off the whiteness of her skin. Alice followed discreetly, her expression tense. Julian came in alone, choosing a seat 2 rows behind his aunt, his arms folded, his eyes scanning the room with a defensive quickness. Mrs. Grover, already ensconced on the aisle, shifted to make room for Mrs. Alder from the post office, who had plainly brought both her knitting and her appetite for revelations. At 10 precisely, the coroner, Mr. Elwood, a small man with an unexpectedly resonant voice, called the room to order. The formalities were brisk. Identification of the deceased, a brief statement of circumstances, and then the evidence. Dr. Bellamy was first. His account was as clinical as it was unembellished. Cause of death was acute cardiac arrest, induced by a toxic dose of digitalis. Estimated time of death, between 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the afternoon of the 17th. No external injuries. The substance could have been ingested in tea, which is the most likely medium given residue found in the stomach. Was there any sign the deceased administered it to himself? The coroner asked. The quantity would have been far in excess of any therapeutic dose. In my opinion, it was not accidental. There was a murmur through the hall, quickly hushed. Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Penrose's hands tighten slightly around her handkerchief, and Julian's jaw clench, though his eyes never left the floorboards. Alice was called next. She repeated her account of laying the tea at 4:15, leaving for cream, speaking to Mrs. Grover, and returning to find her mistress calling for the police. She spoke simply, without embroidery, and when asked directly whether she had touched the tea things after Mr. Randall's death, she shook her head firmly. "Did you see anyone go into the house while you were away?" "No, sir. Only Mrs. Grover at the gate." Mrs. Grover's turn brought a change in the room's temperature. She enjoyed her role too much for propriety, yet she was careful not to seem entirely gleeful. She confirmed her sighting of Alice, the arrival of the parcel from Hillman's, and her glimpse of Mrs. Penrose's hand on the door latch. It was white as paper, her fingers, Mrs. Grover added for color. And she looked this way and that before she took the parcel in. "Did you see the deceased arrive?" "No, sir. But I know he admired that cuckoo clock. Told me so himself. Said it always struck the hour right on the mark, which I could have told him was a fairy tale." Mr. Pettigrew was next. He admitted to walking past the house en route to see Mr. Randall about his lease, but denied entering. The front door was ajar, the curtains drawn. I could hear the clock going, wrong hour as ever. I decided not to intrude. The coroner glanced at Willis. "You've examined this clock?" Willis rose from his seat at the side. "Yes, sir. It's been running several minutes fast for at least a week. The weights are uneven. We've not found evidence it was altered on the day in question, but it could be adjusted easily." "Could this have affected witnesses' perception of time?" "Yes, sir. Anyone using that clock would have believed it was earlier than it actually was." There was a pause, a ripple of speculation. Miss Marple kept her eyes lowered, the better to see people when they believed they were not being watched. She saw Julian's glance flick toward his aunt and away again, and Mrs. Penrose's lips pressed together with the faintest suggestion of irritation rather than grief. Julian's own evidence was brief. He admitted to collecting the ladder from the scullery and glancing into the parlor to check the time. Clock said 5 to 4. I knew it was wrong. Closer to 20 to 5 by my watch. Randall wasn't there then. The coroner leaned forward. You didn't see him at all that day? No, sir. Last I saw him was a week ago when we fixed his motorbike. When it was Mrs. Penrose's turn, she rose with an air of quiet resolve. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, as she described expecting Mr. Randall at 4:30, growing concerned when he failed to arrive, and sending Tommy Briggs to look for him. She confirmed receiving the parcel from Hillman's, earlier than expected, and placing it in the sideboard until she could put it away properly. You never offered Mr. Randall tea? I had the tea ready, she said. But he never took any. When I found him. She paused, composing herself. I rang for Alice, and she fetched the police. The coroner looked over his glasses. Did you move anything in the parlor between laying the tea and the police arriving? She hesitated. Only the sugar tongs. They were out of place. Miss Marple heard the faintest sigh from Willis's direction. She herself kept her face bland, though the admission was a small but telling thread in the tapestry she was weaving. When the evidence was done, the coroner summed up. We have a man, in apparent good health, who dies suddenly of digitalis poisoning between 5 and 6 in the afternoon. The poison was likely administered in tea, though the exact moment of ingestion is uncertain. No witness saw the deceased take tea, and the only people in or near the house in the critical hour were Mrs. Penrose, her maid Alice, her nephew Julian, and Mr. Pettigrew passing by. The clock in the parlor was inaccurate, which may have caused confusion about times. He concluded with an open verdict. Death by poisoning, administered by person or persons unknown. The hum of voices as the hall emptied was more like the rush of a tide than conversation. Outside, Miss Marple stood a moment in the thin sunlight, allowing the crowd to drift past her. Mrs. Grover was in animated discussion with Mrs. Alder, already translating the day's facts into something more entertaining. Julian stalked away toward the garage, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Mrs. Penrose accepted murmured sympathies with a graciousness that did not reach her eyes. Sergeant Willis joined Miss Marple at the gate. Well, you've got that look. It's always useful, she said mildly, to see how people tell a story when they know it will be written down. Some embellish, some leave things out, and some, without meaning to, shift the hour to suit themselves. And of course, she added, when a clock lies, one must ask who taught it to do so. Willis grunted. You think the clock's the key? I think, said Miss Marple, that the clock was one key. But one does not open a locked box with only one key, unless one has been very careful to make all the other locks false. She left him with that and walked toward the churchyard, where the grass was still heavy with the morning's damp. She paused at a bench, ostensibly to rest, but in truth to watch as Mrs. Penrose's path took her past the yew hedge and into the lane toward Hollyhock House. Halfway along, she was stopped by Mr. Pettigrew. They spoke for less than a minute. Then he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Mrs. Penrose standing very still before she resumed her walk. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple had learned to value small things. The pause in Mrs. Penrose's stride was just long enough for a thought to take root. Perhaps one planted by Mr. Pettigrew, perhaps one that had been waiting to grow. Either way, it told her that the conspiracy she suspected was not a single thread, but a weave. And somewhere in that weave, a cuckoo clock had been set to the wrong hour so that a man might die unnoticed until it was far too late. As she rose to go, she reflected that conspiracies in villages were rarely grand affairs. They were made not of intrigue and international danger, but of personal motives, practical deceit, and the very ordinary human wish to be believed. It was that wish, in her experience, which so often betrayed the wisher in the end. That evening, the light over St. Mary Mead thinned to a watery gold, the kind that made the hedges look more solid than the houses and the chimneys sharper than the roofs. The inquest had left the village with a renewed appetite for speculation, and the public rooms of the Blue Boar were thick with smoke and quiet conspiracies. Miss Marple, however, did not join the gossipers. She preferred to let rumor run its natural course, like a stream swollen after rain, before she stepped in to see what the waters had carried with them. Instead, she took her tea alone, then set out for a small walk under the pretense of admiring the dusk. Her feet, as if by instinct, led her toward Hollyhock House. Lamps were lit in the downstairs windows. The curtains were drawn, but not quite evenly, leaving a narrow strip through which light spilled onto the path. She noticed the parlor curtains had been pulled a little farther to one side than usual, as though someone within had wished to glance out without making it obvious. She had not meant to meet anyone, yet as she rounded the hedge, she encountered Alice emerging from the side gate, a small basket over her arm. The girl started slightly at seeing her. "Off to the shop?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly. "Just to Mrs. Alder's for eggs, ma'am," Alice replied, her tone polite but cautious. Miss Marple glanced at the basket. "A rather late hour for marketing." Alice hesitated, then said, "Mrs. Penrose decided she wanted a sponge for tomorrow's tea. She says it takes the eggs better if they're fresh." "Quite true," Miss Marple said. "Though I've always thought the real secret of a good sponge is how one folds the flour. My aunt used to say it was like coaxing a child, firm enough to keep order, gentle enough not to make it sulk." Alice gave a small, nervous laugh and moved on. Miss Marple watched her go, noting the speed of her step and the way she kept glancing over her shoulder. A girl might hurry out of eagerness or fear. It was the looking back that spoke of the latter. The following morning, Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Penrose. The lady received her in the parlor, which was immaculately arranged, the cuckoo clock ticking away in its usual, slightly smug manner. The weights still hung unevenly. "My dear," Miss Marple began, "I wanted to return the pattern you lent me for that lace edging. Such a clever design, though I should think it quite time-consuming." Mrs. Penrose's smile was polite but tight. "I'm glad you found it useful. Lace is one of life's small refinements, don't you think?" "Indeed. And speaking of lace, I understand you had a parcel from Hillman's earlier than you expected." Mrs. Penrose's expression did not change, but her fingers tightened minutely on the arm of her chair. "Yes. An odd thing. I had ordered them for Friday. The girl brought them Wednesday afternoon instead. I hadn't time to inspect them until later." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. It is always a pity when one receives something too soon. It disarranges one's plans. "I suppose you opened the parcel at once, in case the contents were not as ordered?" "I put it in the sideboard. There were other matters at hand." Her hostess's eyes dropped for the briefest moment toward the low table where the tea tray had been set that fateful afternoon. Miss Marple let the silence rest just long enough to become noticeable, then changed the subject to roses, leaving as though she had merely made a neighborly call. From Hollyhock House, she went straight to Much Benham. Hillman's drapery shop was tidy and well lit, smelling faintly of lavender sachets and new cloth. Miss Hillman herself, a woman with sharp spectacles and sharper memory, greeted her. "I was curious," Miss Marple said after a few pleasantries, "about an order Mrs. Penrose placed for lace napkins." Miss Hillman adjusted her spectacles. Ah, yes. 12, white, hand-edged. Due for delivery Friday. But our delivery girl was already coming into St. Mary Mead on Wednesday, so I told her to take them along. A harmless favor, I thought. You wouldn't have happened to notice anything unusual about the parcel when you packed it? Unusual? No. Though, now you mention it, the tissue paper inside was a bit crumpled. We'd had the set on display for a few days, and I think one of the juniors rewrapped it in a hurry. Miss Marple thanked her and left. Crumpled tissue was nothing in itself. Yet combined with early delivery, it suggested an opportunity. One that might have been used to slip something small and potent between folds of linen. On her way back, she stopped at the garage. Julian was leaning against the doorframe, smoking. His posture was casual, but his eyes were sharp. Still curious about my comings and goings? He asked with a half-smile. I've always believed, Miss Marple said, that comings and goings tell you more about a person than what they do while they're standing still. He laughed shortly. And what of mine told you? That you are careful with your movements. Careful enough to make sure they can be accounted for, even if no one actually saw them. That's a rare quality in a young man. His gaze hardened slightly. You think I had something to do with Randall's death? My dear boy, I never think anything until I must. But I have noticed you were in the house that day, in a position to see the tea tray before Mr. Randall arrived. Julian flicked away his cigarette. If I'd wanted him dead, I wouldn't have waited for him to come to tea. He came to the garage often enough. Perhaps, she said mildly. But a garage is a public place. A parlor, especially one with the curtains drawn and a clock set to the wrong time, is quite different. He made no answer, and she left him to think on it. That afternoon, Sergeant Willis called at her cottage. He carried a small paper packet, folded with the precision of officialdom. From the lab, he said. Traces of digitalis found on one of the lace napkins from Mrs. Penrose's parcel. Not much, but enough to kill if it were dusted into a cup of tea. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Then the question becomes, who had the chance to dust it there? The maid who laid the tea? The nephew who glanced in at the parlor? The hostess herself? Or perhaps someone before it even reached the house? Willis frowned. If it was in the napkins from the shop, anyone could have done it there. Yes. But not just anyone would know when they'd be delivered and who would be using them for tea that day. That requires knowledge of habits. In villages, Sergeant, knowledge is a form of possession, often guarded more fiercely than money. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting set aside, and went over the sequence again. Mr. Randall arrived sometime between 5 and 6. The tea tray is late already. The cuckoo clock reads an earlier hour than it truly is. The hostess expects him at 4:30, yet does not raise alarm until much later. And somewhere in that neat parlor, a cup receives a dusting of poison, unnoticed. The wrong time on the clock could serve to make an alibi, but it could also be used to mislead the victim, persuading him he was early, for example, and had time to linger before tea. That would give someone an interval in which to prepare things just so. She thought, too, of Mrs. Penrose's dislike of disorder. If she saw a cup she thought spotted or cracked, she might replace it automatically. And if that cup happened to contain a fatal preparation, it would vanish from view without a thought. The danger hidden beneath a hostess's well-meant fussiness. The more she considered, the more it seemed to her that the cuckoo clock and the lace napkins were not separate curiosities, but part of the same careful arrangement. An arrangement intended to create both the opportunity and the confusion needed for murder. And yet, she thought, there was still something missing. A true conspiracy, even in a small village, usually required more than one pair of hands. One to arrange, another to distract, perhaps even a third to ensure the wrong hour was believed. She suspected that when she found that missing element, the rest would fall neatly into place, like a clock's hands clicking into the true time. The following morning broke crisp and bright, as though the weather had taken it upon itself to tidy up after the inquest's damp gloom. The light lay sharp across the rooftops, showing every ridge tile and chimney pot. And in St. Mary Mead, it was impossible to walk more than 20 paces without hearing a voice raised in discussion of the case. The coroner's open verdict had left the field wide for speculation, and the villagers were busily cultivating it. Miss Marple, however, had no intention of letting the chatter set her pace. She had her own quiet errands, each designed to bring her closer to the peace she still lacked. She began at the vicarage, ostensibly to drop off a basket of scones for Mrs. Clement, but in truth, to learn more about the day of the murder. The vicar's wife, a well-meaning woman who believed her interest in human affairs to be purely charitable, greeted her warmly and ushered her into the drawing room. "You were near Hollyhock House that afternoon, I believe?" Miss Marple said, after a few pleasantries about the weather and the flower show. "Yes, indeed. I had gone to see Mrs. Penrose's roses. They are a marvel this year." I stopped at the gate, as I always do. We chatted about the aphids and the dreadful wind we had in March. I didn't go in, of course. She seemed occupied. There was a parcel on the sideboard, I remember. White paper, blue string. She said it was linens from Much Benham. At what time was this? Oh, about 4:30 by my watch. I recall thinking I should be getting back to put the kettle on before the vicar returned. Miss Marple noted the time without comment. It was significantly later than Mrs. Penrose's own account of the parcel's arrival, yet still before the supposed window of death. The clock's wrongness loomed again in her mind. From the vicarage, she walked to the green, where she found Tommy Briggs idling by the pond, skipping stones. He brightened at her approach. Tommy liked Miss Marple, because she never spoke to him as if he were a child who ought to be elsewhere. "You ran an errand for Mrs. Penrose the other day," she said, her tone lightly conversational. "To the station path, wasn't it?" "Yes, ma'am. She told me to see if Mr. Randall was coming, but I didn't see him." "What time was that?" "About 5, I think. The church clock was striking when I set out. I waited a bit, then went back. Told her I hadn't seen him." "And she was?" "She looked cross. Said he must have been delayed." Miss Marple thanked him and moved on, the threads tightening in her mind. Mrs. Penrose had known he was not on the station path, yet had not sounded alarm. Instead, she had continued preparing for tea, a tea that would never be drunk. By mid-morning, she found herself outside the Blue Boar, where Mr. Pettigrew was leaning against the rail, smoking his pipe. His greeting was amiable, but there was a guardedness in his eyes. "I wonder," Miss Marple said gently, "if you and Mr. Randall ever discussed anything apart from your lease." Pettigrew hesitated, tamping his pipe. "We may have touched on other matters. He was a shrewd man, as I've said. He had a nose for people's vulnerabilities. I suppose some might have found that dangerous." "Did you?" A wry smile. "I liked him well enough, but I wouldn't have trusted him with my will. He enjoyed having the upper hand. And I dare say he knew that Mrs. Penrose had more fondness for his company than was entirely wise. That sort of knowledge can be awkward for all concerned." As she walked away, Miss Marple reflected that awkward knowledge had a way of fermenting into motive. If Mr. Randall had intended to use what he knew about Mrs. Penrose, about anyone, it might have prompted preemptive action. After luncheon, Sergeant Willis appeared at her garden gate. He looked less harried than usual, which Miss Marple took as a sign that something had broken loose in his investigation. "We've confirmed the napkins. From Hillman's were tampered with before Mrs. Penrose got them," he said. "Fibers from the tissue paper match some found in the fold of the poisoned one. That means the poison could have been placed there at the shop, or by anyone who handled the parcel before it reached her." Miss Marple set down her trowel. "And who, Sergeant, knew when that parcel would be delivered early?" "Only the shop, the delivery girl, and, well, anyone she told along the way. We've spoken to the girl. She swears she took it straight from the shop to Mrs. Penrose, stopping only once, at the post office to deliver letters. Says she left it on the counter while she handed them over." "That," said Miss Marple, "is more than enough opportunity, if one had both the will and the knowledge. And the post office is a place where such knowledge is as common as stamps." Willis frowned. "You think Mrs. Alder might—" Miss Marple shook her head. No. Mrs. Alder would never risk her good name for such a thing. But she hears everything. And she might mention a parcel in passing to someone who would know what use to make of it." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked past the post office. Mrs. Alder was inside, bustling with the satisfaction of someone who is part of a story without being its subject. When Miss Marple inquired about her health, Mrs. Alder was quick to mention the lace parcel. "Yes, the Hillman's girl left it here for a moment. Such a pretty package. I said to young Mr. Dent, who was in posting a letter, that it was going to Mrs. Penrose for her tea party. He asked when, and I told him it was that very afternoon. Well, you know how Dent is, always joking. Said he hoped they'd save him a slice of sponge." Miss Marple smiled, thanked her, and left. Mr. Dent was a mechanic at the garage. And where the garage was, there was Julian. By evening, the shape of the matter was clearer. The poison had been placed in the napkins, while the parcel was unattended at the post office. Whoever did it knew Mrs. Penrose was expecting Mr. Randall, and that the tea would be laid with those napkins. But the clock was the more cunning touch. It allowed someone to appear to be elsewhere at the crucial moment, while in truth being present enough to act. That night, as she prepared for bed, Miss Marple considered the trio of Mrs. Penrose, Julian, and Mr. Pettigrew. Each had opportunity. Each had some motive, whether it was self-preservation, protection of another, or advantage over the victim. But only one, she thought, had the particular blend of precision and domestic fastidiousness required to set such a neat trap. The missing element was not a who, but a when. The exact sequence by which the wrong hour, the early parcel, and the laying of tea converged. And she was beginning to see how it had been done. The cuckoo clock, like all accomplices, had merely followed instructions. It was the hand that set it wrong, which truly mattered. Tomorrow, she decided, she would call at Hollyhock House one more time. And this time she would ask the sort of questions that sound like idle chatter, until they are not. The answers, if she was right, would set the cuckoo calling for the last time in this particular conspiracy. The next morning was soft and hazy, the kind of pale weather that muffles sound and makes colors look like they've been washed once too often. Miss Marple, who believed that the right sort of morning often coaxed people into saying more than they meant to, set out for Hollyhock House with a mind as tidy as her knitting basket. She had decided that this visit would be different from the others. There would be no mention of clocks, no questions about napkins or times. Instead, she would talk about people and let the answers find their own way to the surface. Mrs. Penrose greeted her in the hallway, looking polished but faintly brittle, as though the last few days had thinned her composure. The parlor was as immaculate as ever. The cuckoo clock gave a self-satisfied tick-tock from its high perch, the pendulum swing so steady it might have been mocking. "My dear, how you keep this room so perfectly in order is beyond me," Miss Marple said, settling herself in a chintz-covered armchair. "My own parlor always seems to have one thing out of place, usually because someone has moved it when I'm not looking." Mrs. Penrose smiled thinly. "I can't abide disorder. I notice it immediately. Even as a girl, I couldn't bear a crooked picture or an uneven curtain. I suppose it's a habit now." "Habits are the strongest part of one's nature," Miss Marple agreed. "It's funny, though. Sometimes they lead us into doing things without quite realizing it. I remember once, at a neighbor's, a guest accidentally picked up my cup and set it back down, and without thinking, I switched it for another. Later, it occurred to me that I had no idea why I'd done it, only that it felt necessary." Mrs. Penrose's hands, folded in her lap, moved slightly, the right thumb brushing the knuckle of the left in a slow, rhythmic stroke. "One does such things automatically." "Yes, and it is exactly those small, automatic actions that so often matter most," Miss Marple said, her voice mild but her eyes sharp. "We think of crime as a grand, decisive act. But more often than not, it is the little things that go unnoticed until afterwards." For a moment, Mrs. Penrose said nothing, her gaze fixed on the window. Then she asked abruptly, "Do you believe Mr. Randall was murdered?" Miss Marple's answer was prompt. "I do. I believe someone in this village planned it very carefully. I also believe they counted on the fact that no one would suspect them because their actions would seem perfectly ordinary. Just part of their nature." There was a flicker, a quick, almost imperceptible shift in Mrs. Penrose's expression, before she smoothed it away. "Such a thought is dreadful," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple did not press. She knew the danger of forcing a door that would open of its own accord if left to the right hand. Instead, she spoke of village matters, letting the conversation drift until she could politely take her leave. Outside, she walked slowly down the lane, considering what she had seen. Mrs. Penrose's veneer was holding, but only just. The habit of perfect order was not merely a quirk. It was a reflex, one that could tidy away a poisoned cup as naturally as a crooked doily. Her next stop was the garage. Julian was working on a small saloon car, the bonnet up, his hands black with grease. He straightened when he saw her, looking wary. "Still interested in my movements, Miss Marple?" he asked. "I am always interested in young men who seem too clever for their own good," she said cheerfully. "I spoke with Mrs. Alder yesterday. She mentioned you were in the post office the afternoon the Hillman's parcel was there." Julian's expression barely changed, but the tightening of his jaw was answer enough. "I was. Just posting a letter for the garage." A letter, or a glance at what the girl had brought from Much Benham. He gave a short laugh. "You think I slipped poison into a parcel in broad daylight? That's rich." "I think," said Miss Marple, "that someone who knew the parcel contained the very napkins that would be laid for tea that afternoon, and who knew when that tea would be served, would have an advantage worth having, especially if they also knew the parlor clock was keeping the wrong time." Julian's eyes narrowed. "You're hinting at a lot without actually saying anything." "That's how one learns, dear boy. by watching how people react to what is not quite said. She left him to his engine, certain she had confirmed that he had handled, or at least examined, the parcel. Whether he had poisoned it was another matter. But it meant that two people, Julian and Mrs. Penrose, had the necessary proximity to the napkins before Mr. Randall arrived. That afternoon, she sat in her own parlor, knitting and thinking. She kept returning to the clock. In every account, its wrongness had been noticed, even commented upon. That suggested it was not merely inaccurate by chance. It had been kept deliberately so. A clock that is 5 or 10 minutes fast or slow is common enough. A clock that is wrong by exactly the amount needed to suit a particular alibi is rare indeed. She thought of Mr. Pettigrew, passing by and hearing it, of Julian, glancing at it in the parlor, of Mrs. Penrose, who lived with it and could have set it to whatever time suited her. And then she thought of Mr. Randall himself, remarking on its supposed accuracy to Mrs. Grover only days before. That remark, she realized, was the pivot. If Randall had truly believed the clock was right, then he could have been lured to act according to its false hour. He might have believed he was early, that there was time to sit and talk before tea, to drink from a cup offered as a casual refreshment, never knowing it was not the cup meant for him at all. The next morning, Miss Marple acted. She invited Sergeant Willis to her cottage under the pretense of discussing some Women's Institute matter. When he arrived, she poured tea and said without preamble, "Sergeant, if you were to ask Mrs. Penrose whether she has recently had the cuckoo clock cleaned or adjusted, I think you might find she has. And if you were to compare the setting of that clock to the exact time of her telephone call to you on the day of the murder, you might find it instructive." Willis frowned. "You think she's been using the clock to give herself an alibi?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that the clock was set to make her seem elsewhere at the vital moment, when in fact she had all the time in the world to make a small, seemingly innocent adjustment to the tea tray. And I think she is not the only one in this, though she may be the one who poured the tea." Willis stared at her. "You're saying more than one person was involved?" "Very likely. Poisoning is a timid crime. It favors conspiracies. One to place the poison, one to deliver it, perhaps one to distract. But the mind that set the clock wrong and trusted in its lie, that was the mind that understood how people see time not as it is, but as they believe it to be." He made a note, and she could see his mind working. The evidence was still circumstantial, but the shape of it was clear. The napkins, the parcel, the wrong hour, the hostess's instinct for neatness. Each was a cog in a little machine built to kill without ever seeming to. When he left, she sat a long while by the fire, listening to her own small mantel clock strike the hour. She thought of the cuckoo in Hollyhock House, popping out to mark a time it had been told to tell, its cheerful wooden face never betraying the deceit it served. And she knew, as surely as she knew the feel of good wool between her fingers, that the next step would be to make the clock betray its master. The plan was almost complete in her head. She would call again at Hollyhock House, this time with a small, deliberate pretense that would require Mrs. Penrose to refer to her parlor clock. And when she did, Miss Marple would be watching not the hands of the clock, but the face of the woman who had lived by its false hours. It was the sort of day St. Mary Mead did best. Blue sky washed thin by a gentle breeze, warm enough for garden work, but not so warm that anyone would waste an afternoon indoors. The village hummed with the easy busyness of washing lines, clipped hedges, and gossip exchanged over low fences. Miss Marple, wearing a straw hat that shaded her eyes without obscuring her watchfulness, made her way toward Hollyhock House with the air of a woman on an entirely harmless errand. She carried in her handbag a small embroidery sampler, an old one, slightly frayed, which she intended to return to Mrs. Penrose, claiming she had mistaken it for her own. It was the kind of neighborly confusion that would never seem out of place in a village. Yet it would give her a reason to sit in the parlor and talk, and, crucially, to glance at the cuckoo clock without drawing attention to the fact that she was doing so. Mrs. Penrose received her in the hall. She looked well put together, but the faint shadow beneath her eyes told of restless nights. The parlor, as always, was immaculate. The scent of lavender polish hung in the air. "How thoughtful of you to return it so promptly," Mrs. Penrose said, accepting the sampler and glancing at it without much interest. "Do sit down. I can have Alice bring tea." "Not at all necessary," Miss Marple said pleasantly, though she knew Alice would be summoned regardless. Mrs. Penrose liked the propriety of a tray between guests, as much a fixture of conversation as the chairs themselves. They talked for a few minutes about the church fete and the Women's Institute's latest plans. Then, as Miss Marple had hoped, the cuckoo clock began to stir. Its little door creaked open, and the carved bird popped out, issuing its call. Mrs. Penrose glanced up. "Oh, 7 already? How the day goes." Miss Marple, feigning mild surprise, took out her small silver watch and consulted it. "That's odd, my dear. My watch says 20 past 6. A pause, only a heartbeat. But Miss Marple saw the faintest tightening of Mrs. Penrose's mouth before she smiled. "Oh, the clock is never quite right. I've been meaning to have it seen to." "Some clocks," Miss Marple observed, "never quite keep time unless one is constantly setting them." Mrs. Penrose gave a light laugh that did not quite reach her eyes. "Yes, indeed." Alice entered then with the tea tray. Miss Marple watched her closely as she set it down. Cups placed precisely, sugar tongs neatly aligned, a small plate of shortbread. Alice's movements were careful but not over-deliberate. She did not look at her mistress, and Miss Marple thought she detected in the girl a subdued unease, as though she were walking on a floor that might tilt at any moment. When Alice had gone, Miss Marple took her cup and said conversationally, "Such a lovely tray. Your new napkins, I see." "Yes." Mrs. Penrose's voice was even, but her eyes flicked briefly toward the folded lace edges. "I decided they were too fine to hide away." Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. "And yet, sometimes when something is very fine, one hesitates to use it at all, lest it be spoiled. A pity, of course, if one had taken special steps to have it in time." That flicker came again, so small that most would have missed it. "It was no trouble," Mrs. Penrose said quickly. "The shop sent them ahead." "I wonder," Miss Marple said softly, "if it was ahead of the clock as well as ahead of the day." Mrs. Penrose's teacup rattled faintly against its saucer. She set it down with more care than was strictly necessary, and changed the subject. Miss Marple did not prolong the visit. She left after another quarter hour, having planted what she meant to plant. In her experience, the seed of a suggestion could grow quickly when the soil was rich with unease. Outside, she crossed the lane and walked up toward the churchyard, where Sergeant Willis had been waiting by prior arrangement. He stepped out from behind the yew hedge. "Well?" "She noticed the difference between the clock and my watch," Miss Marple said. "She tried to dismiss it. That tells us she knows exactly what the clock is set to, and she will not have it altered until she's sure the danger has passed, which, of course, it has not." Willis frowned. But we've still got nothing to tie her to actually putting the poison in the cup. Miss Marple's smile was faint, but certain. We do not need to catch her in the act. We need to show that she created the only set of conditions under which the act could succeed. The clock, the early delivery, her habit of perfect order, those are not accidents. They are design. And there is someone else in this with her. Someone who made sure the napkins were ready and primed, so to speak. Julian, Willis said at once. Quite possibly. He was in the post office when the parcel was left. He knew about the tea and he could handle the parcel without drawing suspicion. The question is motive, and whether he acted for himself or for her. They agreed that Willis would quietly re-interview Julian that evening, this time with a focus on his whereabouts in the half hour before Mr. Randall's arrival. Meanwhile, Miss Marple intended to have a word with Alice. She found the maid in the kitchen, polishing the silver. Alice looked up nervously as Miss Marple entered. "My dear," Miss Marple began, "you've been a great help to your mistress during these trying days. It must be difficult, running the household when there's so much to think about." Alice hesitated, then said, "I just do as I'm told, ma'am." "I'm sure you do. And when you laid the tea for Mr. Randall that day, did you notice anything unusual?" Alice's eyes dropped to the silver tongs she was polishing. "Only that the napkin on his side of the tray was folded different. Mrs. likes them in a triangle, but that one was square. I thought maybe she'd done it herself, so I left it." "That was thoughtful of you," Miss Marple said quietly. "And after Mr. Randall came?" "I never saw him, ma'am. I went for the cream, like I said. But when I came back, the square folded napkin was gone, and there was another triangle in its place. I thought maybe I'd remembered wrong." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her arm. "You remembered quite right. You did well not to meddle, Alice." Leaving the kitchen, Miss Marple knew the picture was now clear. The poisoned napkin had been folded differently, perhaps as a signal to the person who would serve it. Mrs. Penrose, with her fuss for uniformity, could not leave it that way. She would replace it, unwittingly delivering the poisoned cup to the intended victim. Or perhaps, if she was part of the scheme, she had known exactly what the square fold meant. That evening, as the last light faded, Sergeant Willis arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with news. "Julian cracked," he said. "Admits he handled the parcel at the post office, but claims he only opened it to check the lace was all there. Says he knew his aunt would be fussy if anything was missing. Swears he didn't put anything in it. But he also admits Randall had been pressing him for money over some gambling debts. Sounds like blackmail to me." Miss Marple nodded. "So, two people with a grievance, each with a piece of the opportunity. If Julian prepared the napkin, his aunt ensured it was used. Between them, they built a little clockwork of deceit. The wrong hour, the marked linen, the orderly replacement. The Cuckoo called when they wanted it to, and no one thought to check another time." Willis ran a hand over his face. "We'll need more than theory to bring them in." "You will," Miss Marple agreed. "But you'll have it soon enough. They've built their crime on timing, Sergeant. And timing can work both ways. A clock can lie for only so long before the truth catches up with it." And as she sat alone after he left, the mantel clock ticking softly beside her, Miss Marple thought of the Cuckoo in Hollyhock House, waiting to burst from its little door on the hour it had been told was right. All it would take now was the right moment to set it calling for the last time, and she intended to be there when it did. The next morning broke in a wash of pale yellow sunlight. the kind that made the church spire gleam and sent the cottagers to their gardens early. Miss Marple, however, had no intention of digging or pruning. She sat by her window, her knitting untouched, considering the problem of the cuckoo clock and the people who had lived by its false hours. It was all there now, the delivery of the lace napkins, the wrong time on the clock, the change in the tea setting, the square-folded linen, the replacement cup. But Sergeant Willis was right. Suspicion was not proof. They needed a moment where the guilty, feeling themselves safe, would reveal their hand. And that would require an arrangement as careful as the one that had killed Mr. Randall. By mid-morning, she had decided exactly how it should be done. Her first step was to call on Mrs. Grover, who was only too pleased to have a listener for her running commentary on the village. After 10 minutes of chatter, Miss Marple said, as though idly, "Do you know, my dear, I've been asked to help sort through some of Mr. Randall's papers, purely to see if there's anything that needs returning to their owners. I expect Mrs. Penrose will be there. One hears she has quite a good memory for small details." Mrs. Grover's eyes lit up. "Oh, if she's there, you'll get to the bottom of it, I've no doubt. She remembers everything, especially if it's out of place." "That," Miss Marple said mildly, "is precisely what I'm counting on." She went next to the vicarage, where she persuaded Mrs. Clement to accidentally mention to Mrs. Penrose that a few items of Mr. Randall's would be shown in the parish hall that afternoon, for the purpose of finding their rightful homes. Nothing formal, just a neighborly sorting out. And of course, the cuckoo clock from Hollyhock House would be there too, as it had stopped and needed to be compared with others to see what was wrong. In reality, the clock had been removed that morning by Sergeant Willis's men, its hands set to the exact time on Miss Marple's watch. It was placed on a side table in the hall, surrounded by odds and ends that had belonged to Mr. Randall. A fountain pen, a silver cigarette case, some books. When Mrs. Penrose arrived, she was perfectly civil but slightly puzzled. "I wasn't aware Mr. Randall had left so many trifles here in the village," she said, taking off her gloves. "The clock, though, that is mine." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed sweetly. "It was thought you might like to see it in working order again." The sergeant had it adjusted. Mrs. Penrose glanced at it, and in that brief glance, Miss Marple saw the flicker of calculation. The hands told the true time now. Mrs. Penrose stepped closer, her expression smoothing into polite interest. "How clever. It seems perfectly correct." Julian entered just then, evidently summoned by his aunt. He looked at the clock, then at her, and for a split second, his face betrayed the recognition that the game had changed. He opened his mouth and then closed it, schooling his features. Miss Marple said, as though changing the subject entirely, "I do wonder, Mrs. Penrose, whether you remember what time you called Sergeant Willis on the day of Mr. Randall's death?" There was the smallest hesitation before she replied, "Why? Just after 8, I believe." "That's right," said Willis, who had been standing a little apart. "The phone record says 8:15. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. "Which is interesting, because when the clock in your parlor read 8:15, the real time was nearly 9. So you had almost a full 3/4 of an hour between when you last saw Mr. Randall alive and when you summoned help. Enough time, perhaps, to tidy away a cup, change a napkin, or anything else that might trouble your sense of order." Mrs. Penrose's lips parted, then closed. "This is absurd." Julian stepped forward quickly. "Aunt, you don't have to answer." "But you might, Mr. Penrose," Willis interrupted. You were in the post office when the Hillman's parcel was left unattended. You knew about the tea. And you knew your aunt would never leave a napkin folded differently from the rest. All you had to do was mark the poisoned one, knowing she'd make the switch herself. Julian's jaw worked, but no words came. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft enough that only those close could hear. It was a neat arrangement, almost as neat as your aunt's parlor. You placed the poison. She delivered it, without ever having to think of herself as doing harm. The clock made it seem you were both elsewhere at the right time. But the trouble with a cuckoo, my dears, is that it pops out whether you want it to or not. And sooner or later, it calls the true hour. For a moment, the hall was silent except for the soft tick of the clock. Then Mrs. Penrose gave a short, brittle laugh. Really, Miss Marple, you make it sound like a parlor game. It is rather like one, Miss Marple said. Only the stakes were a man's life. And you both played very well, until you played one turn too many. Willis took them aside, speaking low, but the meaning was clear enough to those nearby. The coroner's open verdict had given him room to act on fresh evidence, and Alice's testimony about the square-folded napkin, combined with the clock's reset time, would be enough to hold them for further questioning. As Mrs. Penrose and Julian were led out, Mrs. Grover leaned toward Mrs. Alder and whispered with the satisfaction of a woman whose predictions had been proved correct. Miss Marple, meanwhile, stood by the table, watching the cuckoo clock tick with its new, honest measure of the day. She felt no triumph, only the quiet settling of a pattern into place. The crime had been one of arrangement, not passion. Its neatness had been its greatest strength and, ultimately, its undoing. She left the hall and walked home slowly, letting the mild air wash over her. People would talk, of course. They always did. But the talk would shift soon enough to the fete, the roses, the price of tea. The village would settle, as villages always did, into the comfortable illusion that its peace was unbroken. Back in her parlor, Miss Marple took up her knitting once more. She glanced at her own clock, a modest brass carriage model that had kept perfect time for as long as she'd had it, and thought, not without a touch of wryness, how many crimes could be solved if one only asked the right questions about what time it really was? The click of her needles resumed, steady and unhurried, matching the honest tick of the clock. Outside, the day went on, as if nothing had happened. But Miss Marple knew that somewhere, in a quiet cell, two people were learning that there is a great difference between setting a clock to the time you want and making the world believe it. The first is easy. The second, as they had discovered, is impossible to sustain. And the cuckoo, she thought, always calls in the end. The days that followed were curiously quiet in St. Mary Mead, as though the village, having been wound up to an anxious pitch, had now allowed itself to run down to a comfortable stillness. The arrest of Mrs. Penrose and her nephew had been the talk of the first 24 hours, but already the more energetic gossips were turning their attention to the upcoming church fete, to a mild scandal involving the Women's Institute's jam competition, and to whether the rector's sermon had been a shade too long the previous Sunday. Miss Marple, who knew the ebb and flow of village attention, as well as she knew the pattern of her own garden paths, was not deceived. Beneath the surface of apparent calm, the events surrounding Mr. Randall's death lingered in the minds of her neighbors, not so much for the crime itself as for the manner in which it had been carried out. A poisoning was one thing, tragic, regrettable, but familiar to village history. But a murder executed like clockwork, literally and figuratively, was a novelty. Sergeant Willis stopped by her cottage on the third day, removing his hat politely as he stepped in. Thought you might like to know, Miss Marple. The confession came through this morning. Well, of a sort. She poured tea while he explained. Julian, it seemed, had admitted to tampering with the parcel of laced napkins at the post office, slipping the powdered digitalis into the folds of one. He says he did it to keep Randall quiet about some debts, Willis said. Claims he never meant for it to go further, but, well, we've heard that before. Mrs. Penrose's statement matches yours exactly. She saw the napkin folded differently, couldn't bear the irregularity, and switched it for the one she'd set at her guest's place. She insists she didn't know it was poisoned. Miss Marple stirred her tea with an air of mild thoughtfulness. That may even be true in the strictest sense. The most dangerous conspiracies, Sergeant, are those in which one conspirator doesn't think of themselves as such. It eases the conscience remarkably. Willis nodded. We'll be charging them both. The law takes a dim view of convenient ignorance. He glanced at her. I must say, I don't know how you manage it, seeing the shape of things before the rest of us have found the edges. It's only a matter of observation, she said gently. People are creatures of habit, and habits leave patterns. You only have to notice when something falls too neatly into place. After he had gone, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment's reflection. She had no illusions about the matter. Justice in cases like this was never entirely tidy. There would be those who pitied Mrs. Penrose, seeing her as a woman swept along by another's scheme, and others who thought her every bit as guilty as her nephew. But Miss Marple suspected the truth was something more subtle, that Mrs. Penrose had played her part precisely because it fit so naturally into her habits of precision and order. A few days later, she met Alice in the lane. The girl looked relieved, though there was still a shadow in her eyes. I'm glad it's over, ma'am, she said. I keep thinking, if I'd refolded that napkin myself, maybe none of it would have happened. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. My dear, you mustn't blame yourself. Those who plot such things count on others behaving exactly as they always do. And if you'd refolded it, well, they would have found another way. Alice nodded slowly, as if the thought eased her mind a little, and went on her way. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a turn about the village. She passed Mrs. Grover's garden, where the woman was pruning roses with the air of one preparing for battle. Terrible business, Mrs. Grover said, without looking up. But I always said that clock of hers was up to no good. It was not the clock, my dear, Miss Marple said with a faint smile. Only the person who set it. From there, she wandered down to the green, where the preparations for the fete were in full swing. Bunting fluttered from posts, trestled tables stood ready for cakes and preserves, and the air was full of the smell of freshly cut grass. It was the sort of scene St. Mary Mead loved best, a public declaration that life was entirely wholesome and agreeable. Yet Miss Marple knew, as she always did, that human nature was not so tidy. She thought of the neat arc of this particular case. A parcel arriving early, a single napkin folded differently, a hostess's tidy instinct, a clock made to lie. All small, unremarkable details, until they were set together in the right or wrong order. The following Sunday, the vicar preached a sermon on truth and false witness. Miss Marple suspected it was inspired by recent events, though he made no direct reference. She noticed Mrs. Clement looking faintly uncomfortable during the homily, perhaps recalling the way she had helped pass along word of the sorting in the parish hall. People rarely thought of themselves as part of a chain until they reached the end of it. In the week after the arrest, life in the village slipped back into its familiar rhythm. The cuckoo clock, now restored to its rightful place in Hollyhock House, had been reset to the correct time by police order. Miss Marple passed the house one morning and heard it strike 9 as she went by. Honestly, for once. But she suspected that in future, the sound would always carry a faintly hollow note for those who knew its role in the affair. On her own mantel, her brass carriage clock ticked steadily. She found herself glancing at it more often than usual, as though reassured by its truthfulness. She thought again of what she had told Sergeant Willis. A clock can lie for only so long before the truth catches up. In the end, it was not the clock that had given them away, but their own confidence in its lie. A week later, Miss Marple was invited to tea at the vicarage. Several neighbors were there, the conversation cheerful but just a shade too quick in moving past the subject of Mr. Randall. It was as if everyone wanted to prove they had put it behind them. "I suppose," Mrs. Grover said at one point, "that it's a relief for you, Miss Marple, to have the case settled." Miss Marple gave a small, almost self-effacing smile. A relief, yes, but also a reminder. One should never think a peaceful village immune to unpleasantness. Human nature is much the same in the country as it is anywhere else, merely better disguised. Mrs. Grover sniffed, not quite willing to accept that St. Mary Mead was like anywhere else. And the conversation turned to safer ground. That evening, as she walked home along the lane, Miss Marple let the stillness of the hour wash over her. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, the hedgerows whispered with the small movements of birds settling in for the night, and the first stars began to appear overhead. She thought of Mr. Randall, whose shrewdness had finally overreached itself, of Julian, who had thought to protect himself by using another's hand, and of Mrs. Penrose, who had hidden behind the shield of her own habits. There was no pleasure in the ending, only the satisfaction of seeing the truth set in its place, like a crooked picture righted at last. She knew the village would return to its gentle routines, but somewhere in its heart would remain the faint knowledge that a clock had once lied here, and that it had taken a very quiet old lady to make it tell the truth again. Back in her parlor, she lit the lamp and settled with her knitting. The steady tick of her clock filled the room. Outside, the church bell marked the quarter hour, its chime matching her clock perfectly. Miss Marple smiled to herself, just a little. In the end, time always told. And when it did, she thought, it was her task, and her quiet pleasure, to be listening. The following fortnight passed with an almost deliberate quietness, as if St. Mary Mead had conspired to push the matter of Mr. Randall's death to the very back of the communal mind. There were still occasional, muffled references to the Penrose business in doorways and over hedges, but the sharper curiosity had dulled. Gardens were tended, sewing circles resumed, and the village bus trundled along its route with its usual assortment of passengers and parcels. Miss Marple, who understood that apparent calm often concealed a deeper resettling, observed the change with mild interest. She saw the subtle ways in which the story had been woven into the fabric of village lore. Mrs. Grover now recounted it as a cautionary tale about the perils of trusting anyone with a fondness for ornaments. Mr. Pettigrew, when pressed, maintained he had always suspected something queer about that clock, though his suspicion, as he described it, bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. One morning, Miss Marple received a letter from Sergeant Willis. It was brief, written in a sturdy, unpretentious hand. Dear Miss Marple, the case will go to trial next month. Both are to be charged. Julian for administering the poison, Mrs. Penrose for aiding and abetting. Julian has signed a full confession. His aunt continues to claim she acted without knowledge, but the prosecution believes the circumstantial evidence will suffice. Your evidence will not be required in court, though your deductions have been invaluable. I hope you are well. Yours, A. Willis. She set the letter down and thought about it for a while. It pleased her, in a quiet way, that she would not be called to testify. She had no desire for the public theater of a courtroom. Her part had been played already behind the scenes in drawing the threads together. Others could take the bow. That afternoon she walked down to the green, where the fete committee was measuring spaces for stalls. Mrs. Clement, balancing a clipboard and a length of string, hailed her. "Miss Marple, we've been hoping you'd help judge the preserves this year. After all, no one can spot a badly set jelly at 20 paces quite like you." Miss Marple laughed lightly. "I should be delighted, though I'm afraid my standards are old-fashioned. I prefer substance to frills." As they discussed arrangements, she noticed Mrs. Alder passing with a basket on her arm. The postmistress gave a polite nod, but said nothing about the events in which she had unwittingly played a small but vital role. Miss Marple suspected Mrs. Alder now realized how easily an idle remark about a parcel could become the seed of something far more serious. Later, at the Blue Boar, she stopped in for a pot of tea. The landlord, Mr. Harcourt, leaned on the counter. "You've put the village to rights again, Miss Marple. Strange how it's always you who sees the thing clear." "Oh, I don't know about that," she said, smiling faintly. "Most things are clear once you look at them the right way round." A pair of farmers at the far table were discussing the trial in lowered tones. One of them muttered, "Never thought Julian had the brains for it." The other replied, "Brains weren't all his. Half of it was that clock. Clever, if you don't mind being wicked." Miss Marple sipped her tea. She had always known that in time the story would be polished into something more dramatic. The roles shifted, the details embroidered. That was how village memory worked, turning reality into a kind of folklore, where truth was less important than the moral drawn from it. On the Sunday before the fete, she attended morning service. The church was full, the hymns bright, the sermon sensible and brief. As the congregation filed out, she found herself beside Dr. Bellamy. He tipped his hat. "Quite the business, that Penrose affair. You know, I've been thinking, poison is such a cold-blooded way to kill. But this was almost mathematical." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "An arrangement of small, ordinary things, set together just so. It takes patience to do that. Patience and a clear idea of how people behave when they think no one is watching." He looked at her curiously. "And you, I suppose, always watch?" She gave a little shrug. "One learns to, in a village. There is no other way to be sure of what's true." That week, preparations for the fete occupied most of her daylight hours. She baked, stitched bunting, and advised on the placement of the trestle tables, all with her usual quiet diligence. Yet, in the back of her mind, the pattern of the case remained. The parcel, the folded napkin, the host's tidy instinct, the clock that lied. She wondered if Mrs. Penrose, in her cell, still kept track of the hours, and whether Julianne, with nothing to do but wait, had yet realized how easily the whole plan had unraveled once its timing was exposed. On the day of the fete, the green was a cheerful riot of color and sound. Stalls overflowed with cakes and jars, children darted about with paper windmills, and the scent of roasting chestnuts mingled with the sharper tang of polish from the coconut shy. Miss Marple sat beside Mrs. Clement at the preserves table, tasting and noting with an air of benign authority. It was near closing time when Sergeant Willis appeared, weaving his way through the crowd. "Thought you'd like to know," he said quietly. "Word from town. Julian's agreed to plead guilty. The lawyers will work out the rest. Mrs. Penrose is holding to her story, but without him, she's on thin ice. Miss Marple nodded. Sometimes, she said, the only thing that holds a conspiracy together is the belief that no one will ever speak. Once that goes, she let the sentence trail off. Willis understood well enough. As the fate wound down, Miss Marple walked home slowly, the late afternoon sun slanting low over the hedgerows. She passed Hollyhock House. The windows were shuttered, the garden overgrown, already with nettles along the path. The cuckoo clock would not be calling the hours here for some time, if ever again. Back in her parlor, she put away her bonnet and gloves, poured herself a small sherry, and sat listening to the familiar tick of her own clock. She thought of the lies people tell themselves, that their actions are harmless, that their part is too small to matter, that time will keep their secrets. And she thought, not without a certain gentle satisfaction, of how often those lies come undone when the smallest habit is disturbed. Outside, the first stars were pricking through the dusk. The village was quiet, settled, as if it had always been so. But Miss Marple knew better. She knew that peace was not the absence of trouble, only the absence of its immediate memory. And she knew that somewhere, the lesson of the cuckoo clock conspiracy would linger. Not in the law courts, not even in the gossip of the Blue Boar, but in the minds of those who had seen how it worked and how it failed. She reached for her knitting, the click of the needles blending with the measured tick of the clock. Another pattern completed, another puzzle put away. Time, as ever, moved on. And Miss Marple, as ever, was listening. The trial of Mrs. Penrose and Julian Penrose opened on a sharp November morning, the kind where the air seemed to cut like glass and every footstep echoed on the stone pavements outside the county court. St. Mary Mead, of course, was well represented in the public gallery, though few would admit to traveling for the express purpose of attending. It was, officially, a trip into town for shopping or to see a cousin, but there was no mistaking the bright curiosity in the eyes of those who filed into their seats. Miss Marple did not go. She had no appetite for the formalities of barristers' wigs and carefully rehearsed questions. Her work had been done long before the case reached this stage. Instead, she stayed at home in her parlor, the fire burning low, and waited for the inevitable news to drift back along the lanes. It did not take long. By early afternoon, Violet from the post office was at her door, breathless and red-cheeked from the cold. "It's all over bar the sentencing," she announced, barely waiting to be invited in. Julian's pleaded guilty, as they said he would, and Mrs. Penrose, well, the jury took barely an hour. Guilty, though she didn't look at him once while they were in the dock together. Miss Marple listened quietly, pouring tea for the girl, who chattered on about the judge's summing up and how Mrs. Penrose had stood very straight when the verdict was read, as if she were determined not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her falter. "And Julian?" Miss Marple asked. "Wouldn't meet anyone's eye, just stared at the floor. They'll sentence them next week." After Violet had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long while, her hands folded in her lap. She felt no particular sense of triumph. The end of a case was never about satisfaction for her, only about clarity, about placing each piece where it belonged, so the picture could be seen for what it was. That evening, Sergeant Willis called. "It's done," he said, settling into the chair opposite her. The judge was plain about it, said it was a calculated, deliberate act, dressed up as the ordinary order of a tea table. And he said that was what made it so dangerous. Miss Marple nodded. "He is quite right. A thing that looks harmless is far more easily believed than one that announces its danger." They'll both get time. The lad more than the aunt, I expect. But she won't walk away free. Willis looked into the fire for a moment. I sometimes wonder if she knew from the start what he was about. Oh, she knew, Miss Marple said gently. Not in the way one knows a fact, written down and signed, but in the way one knows when it is going to rain. She recognized the signs, even if she told herself not to. And in the end, she acted exactly as he counted on her to act. In the days that followed, the village seemed almost eager to move on, as though some tacit agreement had been made to draw a line under the matter. Hollyhock House, with its shuttered windows and unkempt garden, became merely another empty property awaiting a new tenant. The cuckoo clock, removed as evidence, was stored in the police station, its mechanical bird silent. Miss Marple noticed how the story shifted in the telling. By the second week, Mrs. Penrose had become either a scheming mastermind or a tragic dupe, depending on who was speaking. Julian was alternately described as a cunning young villain or a boy led astray. Mr. Randall, once admired for his shrewdness, was now remembered chiefly for the enemies he had made. The truth, as she knew, was less convenient for anyone's preferred version. On the day of sentencing, Miss Marple took her usual walk past the churchyard, returning home by way of the High Street. She had no need to go into town. The outcome would arrive in the village before she could even put the kettle on. And so it did. Mrs. Alder herself came with the news, under cover of delivering the monthly parish newsletter. 7 years for him, Mrs. Alder said. 5 for her, though with good behavior they'll be out sooner. Still, long enough to think about what they've done. Miss Marple accepted the leaflet and thanked her. Prison gives people time, she said mildly, but not everyone uses it to think. That night, she sat alone by the fire, the brass carriage clock on her mantel ticking steadily. She thought of the chain of small events that had led from a parcel in a post office to the dock in a county court. A parcel left briefly unattended, a folded napkin, a hostess's compulsion for order, a clock set to the wrong hour, none of them remarkable on their own. Yet together, they had formed a pattern so precise that it had seemed unbreakable. She also thought of Alice, the maid, whose simple recollection of that square-folded napkin had been the final, quiet stroke that made the whole picture clear. The girl had gone back to work for another household now, but Miss Marple hoped she would remember that her truthfulness had mattered. In Miss Marple's experience, such memories could be a source of strength. As winter deepened, St. Mary Mead wrapped itself in its seasonal rhythms. The holly wreaths appeared on doors, the church was scented with evergreens, and the evenings came early, with lamplight spilling warm gold into the lanes. Conversations turned to Christmas puddings and the rumor of a cold snap to come. Miss Marple moved among it all as she always did, present, but unobtrusive, listening, watching, knitting. She never went so far as to say she was finished with the Penrose case. In her mind, such things were never truly finished. They became part of the long tapestry of village life, their threads crossing others in ways no one could predict. On Christmas Eve, she received a small package in the post. It was from Sergeant Willis, a box of chocolates and a short note wishing her the compliments of the season, and thanking her again for putting the hands of the clock where they belonged. She smiled at the phrasing. Time, she thought, had been set right. Not just on the clock in Hollyhock House, but in the matter of truth and consequence. That night, as the church bells rang in the midnight service, Miss Marple sat for a while by her fire before bed, the steady tick of her clock keeping pace with the faint peal from the tower. She thought again of the cuckoo clock, its carved chalet, its jaunty little bird, its falsely honest tick, and how, for a time, it had presided over a parlor where a man had taken his last breath without even knowing he was in danger. And she thought, as she often did at the close of a case, that human nature was both endlessly predictable and endlessly surprising. It would produce, time and again, the same small weaknesses: pride, greed, fear, dressed in new clothes and playing out against new backdrops. And it would always fall to someone, somewhere, to notice when the picture didn't quite match the frame. She rose, stirred the fire, and wound her clock before turning in. It was, she reflected, a comfort to end the year with a timepiece she could trust. The hours ahead, like the village itself, would bring what they would. But she would be listening, as always, for the moment when the cuckoo called again. January settled over St. Mary Mead with a crisp stillness, the kind that made smoke rise in straight, unwavering columns from chimneys and made the frost on the lane sparkle like ground glass. The holiday cheer had been packed away with the tinsel and holly, and the village had returned to its measured pace. For all outward appearances, the matter of Mrs. Penrose and her nephew had been neatly put to rest with their sentencing. But Miss Marple, who understood the way stories linger in small communities, knew better than to think the business entirely gone. There was, inevitably, a residue, an unspoken awareness that the murder had not been the work of a stranger, but of people who had poured tea at village fetes, nodded politely in the pews on Sunday, and smiled over the grocer's counter. For some, it had introduced a permanent faint hesitation before accepting an invitation. For others, it had become an anecdote to be hinted at in the right company. Miss Marple noticed that certain small habits had altered. Mrs. Grover, for example, had developed the habit of looking up at her own clock whenever a caller came to the door, as if to reassure herself that the time was what she thought it was. At the post office, Mrs. Alder now kept parcels behind the counter instead of on it, however briefly. Even the vicar's wife had taken to glancing over the tea tray before it left the kitchen, ensuring that all the napkins matched. One particularly sharp morning, Miss Marple found herself in Much Benham, visiting Hillman's drapery shop to purchase some ribbon for a sewing project. Miss Hillman, recognizing her, came bustling out from behind the counter. "Ah, Miss Marple, I've been meaning to tell you. We've had 3 different customers ask us not to send anything ahead of time, no matter how convenient it might be. I suppose that's your doing." Miss Marple gave a small, non-committal smile. People prefer to feel in control of their own arrangements. And perhaps, she added gently, they prefer to be sure of exactly when something will arrive. On her way back, she stopped at the Blue Boar for tea. The landlord, Mr. Harcourt, brought her pot and cup himself. "Funny thing," he said, leaning confidentially on the table. "But the other day I caught myself setting the bar clock 5 minutes fast. Used to do it all the time, back when I thought it'd help me keep the regulars from lingering past closing. But I stopped. Thought of that Penrose case and decided I didn't want to be mixed up in anything with the time again." Miss Marple thanked him for the tea and thought to herself how curious it was that a single crime could ripple outward in such small, practical changes. The cuckoo clock might have been silenced, but its legacy ticked quietly on in altered habits. As January wore on, she resumed her ordinary routines: a little sewing for the church, a little visiting, a great deal of listening. She noted, without comment, that people had begun to treat her presence with a faint, new respect. Not deference exactly, but the awareness that she saw more than she said. Some were more careful with their words around her, others, paradoxically, seemed to tell her more, as if seeking to have their consciences tested in a safe, indirect way. One afternoon, she was surprised by a visit from Alice, the former maid at Hollyhock House. The girl looked better, healthier, more at ease, but still carried a certain gravity. "I just wanted to thank you," Alice said, twisting her gloves in her hands, "for believing me about the napkin. They said in court that it was my memory of it that helped prove the case." "It was the truth, my dear," Miss Marple said simply. "And the truth is always worth telling, even if it feels small at the time." Alice hesitated. "Do you think she, Mrs. Penrose, ever thought about what would happen to me? If it had gone differently, I mean?" Miss Marple looked at her for a long moment. "People who are arranging something they think very clever rarely consider all the consequences. Their minds are fixed on the success of their arrangement. That is why, so often, they fail." When the girl had gone, Miss Marple sat for a while by the fire, thinking of all the small players in the drama: Alice, Mrs. Alder, Mrs. Grover, even the delivery girl from Hillman's, each of whom had touched the chain of events without ever knowing at the time how vital their part was. Early in February, a letter arrived from Sergeant Willis. It was brief, but its tone was warmer than most of his official communications. "Dear Miss Marple, thought you'd like to know. Penrose has been transferred to Dartford, the aunt to Holloway. Both are said to be keeping to themselves. I expect you'll be relieved to hear they're unlikely to trouble St. Mary Mead again. Regards, A. Willis." She set it aside with a faint smile. Relief was not exactly the word. She had not feared their return. What she felt was more akin to the quiet satisfaction of having closed a drawer properly after something had been put away in it. The rest of the winter passed uneventfully. Snow fell once, briefly, covering the village in white before melting into slush by the following afternoon. The church fete committee began planning its summer program. Conversations turned to seed catalogs and the price of coal. Yet, in the midst of this ordinariness, Miss Marple kept an attentive ear for the telltale sounds of another story beginning. A change in routine here, a hesitation in greeting there. She knew it was only a matter of time. St. Mary Mead was, at heart, like any other place. Its peace was a surface, lovely but thin, beneath which the currents of human nature ran as restlessly as ever. And when the next disturbance came, whether it involved clocks or cups or something entirely different, she would be ready, listening, as always, for the small stray notes that did not fit the tune. For now, the cuckoo clock conspiracy had run its course, leaving behind no bodies in the lane, no fear of strangers, only the lingering awareness that deception could be dressed in the most domestic of clothing. And in her quiet way, Miss Marple thought that might be the most lasting lesson of all. She wound her clock, adjusted the hands to the exact minute, and let its steady tick resume. Outside, the early evening light lay soft over the rooftops, and somewhere in the distance, the church bell marked the hour. True, honest, and uncontrived, exactly as time should be. March came softly to St. Mary Mead, like a cat stepping over a threshold. The hedges lifted their faint green haze, the allotments darkened with turned soil, and the mornings brought a chorus of birds loud enough to make even the late sleepers surrender. The village, which had been keeping its voice lowered through winter, found itself speaking in a normal tone again. It was a change one felt rather than saw, and Miss Marple, whose senses were tuned to such alterations, welcomed it in her quiet fashion. She had fallen into a gentle routine of small spring labors, thinning seedlings on her windowsill, repotting a geranium that had outgrown its pot, and writing brief notes to friends further afield. Now and then, Sergeant Willis stopped by on some pretext, returning a borrowed gardening book or to ask whether she had ever tried soot on blackfly. Both understood the courtesy of these visits. The worst of the business was behind them, but the friendship born in the midst of it required a little tending. On a mild Tuesday, Miss Marple set out early to attend to a matter that was not, on the face of it, important. She had learned that Hollyhock House had been let on a 6-month lease to a retired schoolmaster and his wife, who wished to try the country before committing to it. The letting agent, who had not lived through the events of the winter, but had heard them in sufficient outline to turn profit into delicacy, had asked Miss Marple if she would just look in after the keys were handed over. To assure the newcomers, if assurance were needed, that a parlor was only a parlor once the right hands put a tea tray on it, Mrs. Perry, the incoming tenant, opened the door to Miss Marple's knock with a brisk cordiality that suggested she had always arrived places efficiently. She was a woman of good cheer and excellent practical sense. Her husband, Mr. Perry, had the stoop of a man who had read more papers than he had stood in fields, and a kindly gaze that took in corners. "I'm afraid the rooms are rather bare still," Mrs. Perry said, ushering Miss Marple in. "We've opened the windows to air them, and I've had all the curtains down for washing. I hope that isn't sacrilege." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said, pleased. "Houses, like people, are restored by fresh air and soap." The parlor was both altered and familiar. Without the weight of Mrs. Penrose's exact habits upon it, it seemed larger, somehow less watchful. The mantel had been dusted, the carpet shaken, the furniture rearranged by a few inches that made all the difference. On the wall, the mark where the cuckoo clock had hung was still a faint rectangle of paler paint. The new tenants had not replaced it. "We were told," Mr. Perry said, following Miss Marple's eye, "that there had been a clock. The agent wasn't specific, but one gathers it is a piece best left to the police. We'll do without for now. My wife prefers a simple carriage clock. One can carry the truth from room to room, you see. No need to depend upon a bird leaping out to announce it." Mrs. Perry laughed. "Horace, you'll talk in epigrams to a stranger if I let you. Will you take tea, miss?" "Marple," she supplied, "you are very kind, but I won't impose on your first morning." They insisted, as decent people will, and she conceded to a single cup. The tray, when it came, was the ordinary comforting sort. Thick cups, an honest teapot, and plain linen folded with no ambition beyond cleanliness. Miss Marple found, to her surprise, that the sight brought something like relief. It occurred to her then, as the steam curled upward, that one of the small damages a crime does is to cast an unnecessary glamour over ordinary objects. It was well to see them resume their rightful modesty. On her way out, she paused at the gate and looked back. The house, with its gables and slightly pompous windows, now presented itself without an agenda. Houses remember, of course, but as receptacles rather than as witnesses. Their memories consist of the marks left by their occupants, and those can be painted over in time. People, she reflected, do not always have that luxury, but they find other ways. She turned down the lane toward the green. Near the pond, Mrs. Grover had stationed herself with secateurs and a basket, ready to pounce upon any rose cane that offended her sense of discipline. She hailed Miss Marple with her customary air of having been about to say the very thing she was now saying. "I see they've moved in," she said, nodding toward the rise. "Nice-looking couple. Sensible shoes. I always think one can tell about people from their shoes. Do you suppose they'll keep things tidy?" I dare say they will keep them as they like them, Miss Marple said. Which is the best one can ask? Mrs. Grover replied, which in her language meant many things, among them reluctant agreement. Well, I hope they're not the kind to have a lot of folk in and out. I've had enough of goings-on to last me. Then perhaps, Miss Marple said, we shall have only comings and stayings for a while. At the post office, Mrs. Alder had adopted a new sign. Parcels must be handed to staff. It was written in a firm, unembarrassed hand. When Miss Marple complimented her, Mrs. Alder said with a composure that told of careful thought, "It's simpler. No misunderstandings. People prefer things behind a counter, I find." "Quite," said Miss Marple. "Boundaries are a comfort." Spring advanced. The Women's Institute held a lecture on the proper sterilization of jam jars that did unexpectedly well in attendance. The vicar, perhaps chastened by winter's moral crispness, preached a gentle sermon on forbearance. Dr. Bellamy reported, to anyone who asked, that the influenza that had threatened in January had spared them, though he added that the best medicine remained prudence. All this Miss Marple filed in that mental ledger she kept for the state of the village. Alice came to see her one afternoon, eyes bright with a news that did not need announcing. "I've a place in Much Benham," she said almost shyly. "Housekeeping for an elderly lady with a deaf spaniel. It's quiet, but I think I like quiet." "Quiet," Miss Marple said, "is a thing one notices when one has had the other sort. You shall make it suit you." Alice hesitated, then said in a rush, "Sometimes I wake and think of that day, and I wonder if I should have changed the napkin. And then I remember what you told me, and I think, perhaps the way I am is not the worst way to be." "It is certainly the way that saved the truth," Miss Marple said, "and that is never the wrong thing, however much trouble it causes first." They took tea. When the girl left, Miss Marple stood a moment at her gate, watching her go, and thought of all the lives reshaped by the small, sharp edge of the case. Some in obvious ways, some so subtly the owners would not notice until years passed. One mild evening toward the end of the month, she found herself walking farther than she had intended, past the meadows and along a hedgerow that sang with thrushes. The air smelled of damp earth, and somewhere a cow made the kind of satisfied sound that speaks of uncomplicated contentment. It pleased her to think that most lives, most of the time, were made up of such contentments, punctuated now and then by storms from which one emerged damp and wiser. She had nearly reached the stile when she heard hurried footsteps and turned to see Sergeant Willis catching up, cap in hand, face flushed with the effort. "I knew I'd find you out here," he said, panting a little. "I've a message I thought you'd like. The clock's to be disposed of. As evidence, it's had its day. The property people asked whether you'd advise what to do with it." Miss Marple considered. The image of the carved chalet, the cheerful little bird with its mechanical certainties, appeared before her mind's eye with an odd clarity. "Put it up for auction," she said at last. "Not here. Somewhere it will be only an ornament. It has done its mischief in this parish. Better let it tick innocently on a mantel where no one knows its story. Things, like people, deserve the chance to be taken as they are, not as they have been." Willis nodded, impressed. "You think of everything." "I think of enough," she said, smiling. "And sometimes I think not at all, which is a useful relief." They walked back together part way, talking of cabbages and church roofs and entirely unimportant matters. The sun slipped lower, burnishing the hedges, and St. Mary Mead presented itself as it always did to those who loved it. Not innocent exactly, but candid in its way, offering its days one by one, asking only to be kept in reasonable order. In April, a postcard arrived from a town she did not know, the handwriting unfamiliar. It read, "Dear Madam, we purchased a charming Swiss cuckoo clock at a sale last week and have never known such punctual calls to luncheon. My wife says it has given the house a cheerful center. Funny how an object can make a home speak. Yours sincerely." A chaffined Miss Marple put the card on her mantel and regarded it with an expression that mingled amusement and something almost like blessing. The world, she thought, has ways of redistributing the weight of things. Let the clock be cheerful. Let it call the hour with no more burden than wood and spring can bear. She hoped that in that other parlor, the bird's pop and call would be answered by laughter and the clink of harmless cups. And so life moved forward. If one listened carefully in the Blue Boar on certain evenings, one could hear the story told again, briskly or indulgently, depending on who held the center of the group. Each teller moved a piece, added a detail, shaved another down. That was as it should be. Facts were for the court, truth for those who wanted it, and stories for everyone. Miss Marple, who wanted truth and could enjoy a story, did not begrudge the village its embroidery. It had, after all, paid the bill for its entertainment. On a warm day in May, the fete was held, and the preserves were excellent. She gave the prize to a red currant jelly that trembled exactly as a jelly should, and tasted of nothing but fruit and clarity. Mrs. Clement declared that there could be no better criterion, and Miss Marple, speaking for once with authority, said there could not. She found a seat under a chestnut and watched children run, their shouts bouncing off the canvas of tents. She watched old men drop balls at the coconut shy with the grim determination of those who know life's coconuts are rarely obliging. She watched young women compare ribbons with a seriousness that excluded the rest of the world. In all of it, she heard the steady, human tick of a place telling itself it was well. Later, at home, she wound her brass carriage clock and set it gently back on the mantel. The room had gathered the evening about it. She set her knitting in her lap and allowed herself the thought, light as thistledown, but worth having, that this was what she had been for in the village. Not to hold its peace in place, no one can do that, but to notice when the hands had slipped and to set them back without fuss. A draught moved the lace at the window. The garden beyond darkened into that particular green that belongs to English twilight. Somewhere up the lane, a bicycle bell rang twice. The church bell, unhurried and exact, marked the hour, and her own clock agreed with it, as friends agree, with a nod and the comfort of long acquaintance. She thought of Mr. Randall, of Julian and Mrs. Penrose, of Alice's square-folded napkin, of a parcel on a counter, and of a bird that popped from a small door to declare a fiction with confidence. She thought of how little it had taken, in the end, to let the truth be heard over it. Not a trick, not even genius. Only the steady work of noticing. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, the room had not changed at all. That pleased her. She finished a row, counted her stitches, found the number she expected, and smiled. Outside, the evening gathered itself for night. Inside, the clock ticked on, simple and honest. It would do the same tomorrow and the day after, in good weather and ill, when stories began and when they ended. She rose, drew the curtains, and turned, the lamp a shade lower. In the quiet, she heard what she always listened for, the ordinary life of her village continuing exactly as it should, as full of secrets as any place and as capable of telling them at the proper time. She wound the clock once more, a small, precise turn, and let her hand rest on the case in a gesture that was part farewell, part assurance. Then she said very softly to the empty room, as if reporting to an old friend that all was well at last. It was a week after the May fete when Sergeant Willis called at Miss Marple's cottage with a small, paper-wrapped parcel under his arm. He looked uncharacteristically pleased with himself. "I thought you'd like to know," he said, setting it carefully on her table. "They've both written from prison, separately, mind you. Neither letter says much, but taken together, they tell the whole story." Miss Marple poured tea, her eyebrows raised in polite curiosity. "Do they indeed?" Willis nodded. "Julian admits he slipped the powdered digitalis into the napkin at the post office. Says he marked it with the square fold so he'd know which it was, counting on his aunts. Well, habits to switch it without question. And she claims she saw the different fold, thought it untidy, and replaced it automatically." He made a small, skeptical noise. "She swears she didn't know what she was doing. But she does say she was glad to help Julian be rid of an embarrassment." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. That is what I suspected from the beginning. One mind providing the arrangement, the other the motive. Neither could have succeeded alone. But together, she let the thought trail off into the steam from her cup. "They've made it plain now," Willis said. "It was all in the timing. That cursed cuckoo clock. Wrong by just enough to make everyone's recollections of the hour useless as evidence." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A clock, Sergeant, is only as honest as the hand that sets it. In this case, its lie was almost perfect. Just enough to make the fatal half-hour invisible." He leaned back. "It's neat, I'll give them that. Mark the poisoned napkin so the right cup gets it. Make sure the tray's laid before the victim arrives. Let a tidy hostess do the rest. No one sees you touch a thing. Except," Miss Marple said gently, "that people do see, without knowing it. Alice saw the different fold. Mrs. Grover saw the parcel delivered. Mrs. Alder mentioned it at exactly the wrong moment to exactly the wrong young man. And a certain old woman noticed that the clock's weights were uneven." Willis chuckled. "And that was the thread you pulled." "One only needs the right thread," she said. "And a little patience." He pushed the parcel toward her. "From the property store, you might like to see it." She unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay the cuckoo clock, its carved, chalet polished, its tiny wooden bird frozen mid-call. For a moment she looked at it with something almost like pity. "It was never the villain," she said softly. "Merely the accomplice." "What should we do with it?" Willis asked. "Sell it far away," Miss Marple replied. "Let it live out its days in a parlor where no one knows what hour it once kept." He nodded, and they sat for a few minutes in companionable silence, the only sound the ticking of her own small brass carriage clock, steady, honest, and entirely without guile. When he left, Miss Marple remained at the table, the empty brown paper folded neatly beside her. She thought of Mr. Randall, so certain he was master of his own dealings, of Julian, clever enough to make a plan, but too impatient to see its flaws, of Mrs. Penrose, hiding her complicity in the folds of her domestic fastidiousness. And she thought, too, of the web of small, ordinary observations that had brought the truth into the light. She rose, wound her clock with a precise turn, and set it back on the mantel. The hour struck, exact, unembellished, undeniable. "That," she murmured, "is the only time worth keeping."